Hello and welcome to the Arctic Summer College. My name is Max Grünlich from the Ecological Institute, and today's Arctic Summer College session is the first segment of the governance module in our Arctic Summer College this year. It's also more or less a halfway point, so we're in the second half of the webinar series, and we're very excited to have two excellent speakers here today. I'll introduce our first speaker now first, who's also getting ready already. We have Heather Exner-Pirot here, and Heather is not new to the Arctic Summer College. Heather, you've done this many years in a row, so we actually had a very brief training session only. You're the managing editor for the Arctic Yearbook, among many other things. You're also a member of the board of advisors for the Arctic Institute, one of also our partner institutes. You're an editorial board member for the Canadian Journal of Foreign Policy. I won't list all your bio items, there's a lot, but also what I wanted to mention, because I found this important, is that you're also currently a strategist for outreach and Indigenous engagement at the University of Saskatchewan. So Heather, also very briefly, without taking up or replacing your presentation, I just wanted to say very briefly your topic for those of you who haven't seen that yet. So you're going to talk about the Arctic Council in a time of rapid change. And of course, that means climate change, but also geopolitical tensions and many other change dynamics happening at the same time. Heather, thank you for presenting this today to our participants, and also, of course, thank you for being available for question and answer afterwards at the end. I want to say that it's the same procedure as in every session. So we have the discussion after the presentation, and you're all muted by default as usual, but you can raise your hand, you can ask questions in the question pane or use the chat function. And that I have to add, especially for the Andreases, of course, you cannot raise your hand, you cannot ask the questions, you have to use the chat function for that. Andreas Kramer knows that, Andreas Østhagen might not know. So just for you, if you want to ask a question, you can do that via the chat function. Heather, I've talked enough. I think I leave the floor to you and talk to you later. Again, thank you, Heather.
Great, thanks. And can you hear me okay?
Wonderful, wonderful.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks everybody for coming and joining today. And yes, I'm an Arctic Summer College alumni as well as a former speaker. So excited to be here again, and thankful to Max for joining or for asking me again. So today I just wanted to talk about the Arctic Council. When people think about the Arctic and international relations, international affairs, the Arctic Council is usually what comes to mind. If there's a kind of a mainstream media article on it, they often bring up the Arctic Council, and then people start to get somewhat, I think, are some heavy misperceptions of what the Arctic Council does, what it's meant to do, what its mandate is. And so what I hope today to do is to kind of provide an overview of the Arctic Council, how it came about, and then to really inform on you know, what is the niche, what is the narrow purpose that it actually serves. It's not a catch-all. I remember watching an episode of Madame Secretary, and they had the Arctic Council resolving Svalbard and you know, monitoring icebreakers, and it doesn't do everything. It doesn't govern the Arctic. It governs, you know, it has a kind of a small forum kind of a role. So that's what we'll talk about today. And at the end, and we'll move to questions, but hopefully I'll leave you some food for thought so that we can discuss what it should do. And the Arctic Council is just over 20 years old, and they're currently undergoing strategic planning. They've been thinking about doing strategic planning for 4 or 5 years, which tells you a lot about what the Arctic Council actually does. So it took 2 years to decide if they wanted to talk about strategic planning, then a couple of years to get everyone on board. And now they're actually doing strategic planning, and hopefully by the end of the Finnish chairmanship, we'll have a plan. But what is it, you know, what is it that, you know, people like us, civil society academics, think that they should be doing? How can we inform what we think? And actually, I'll be chairing a session at Arctic Circle in Reykjavik on that exact question: what's the future of the Arctic Council? So any thoughts or opinions or feedback you have on that will be most welcome. So feel free to interrupt with questions, and I'll try to keep an eye on that hands up feature. my slides advance. Okay, so what is the Arctic Council? And I'm assuming most of you have at least a general understanding of what it is, but it's what we call, it's Wikipedia site would probably say it's the leading intergovernmental forum amongst the Arctic states, Arctic indigenous communities, and Arctic inhabitants. It was established in 1996 with the Ottawa Declaration, and I'll talk about the history in a minute. A very important thing is it's a forum. It's not a treaty-based organization, and that matters so much in international law. And so all participation and activity is voluntary, and so the 8 Arctic states have to agree to do it by consensus. If one Arctic state, say the United States or Russia, occasionally Canada, say that they don't want to do something, then it just simply doesn't get done. In addition, there's the Indigenous permanent participants, and I'll have a list of them on the next slide, or the next 2 slides, but they don't have a vote per se. People will sometimes say, oh, the Indigenous group should have a vote, but it's not really a voting organization because it is consensus based. And so it would be quite unusual for the 8 Arctic states to be unanimous on something and have consensus on something that the 6 Indigenous groups were totally opposed to. And so really, that is its greatest strength and its greatest weakness also. So the strength is that everything the Arctic Council does has everyone's backing, and so it's very sustainable and it's very progressive. On the other hand, things can really get watered down because no one will move forward until everybody can move forward, and that can take a lot of time. In the Ottawa Declaration, which is about a 2-page document, there was a little asterisk, and it said that the Arctic Council should not deal with matters related to military security. What it focuses on are issues of sustainable development and environmental protection. In the last 10 years, there's been a lot of debate on whether it should or shouldn't. A lot of people suggest that it should deal with military security, that somebody should deal with military security in the Arctic. And again, for me, this stems from the idea that the Arctic Council is the only game in town, that if the Arctic Council doesn't deal with it, that it doesn't get done. And so my own opinion is that the reason the Arctic Council has been so successful, despite, say Russia's incursion into Crimea or other kind of external, right now, interference in U.S. elections, American attitudes toward climate change. The reason, it is successful is because it does compartmentalize kind of softer security issues of development and environmental protection, and doesn't have to focus, in fact, can't focus on what might otherwise be deal breaker kinds of issues. And so being able to compartmentalize for military security has really been a boon for it. The other thing is that there are other venues other than the Arctic Council for the Arctic states to discuss things. And back in the 1990s, the Americans specifically said that the Arctic Council, they won't agree to a forum where they deal with military security, because obviously they were thinking about nuclearization and denuclearization with Russia. And there were some sufficient bilateral talks with non-Russian issues. They already had NATO, they had other forums, so the United States didn't replicate things that were already happening to deal with those issues. So there was a caveat of theirs that they did not want to discuss military security. On the Canadian side, the kind of NGO and Indigenous movement that was bringing forward the Arctic Council, the idea of the Arctic Council really was focused on denuclearization, but were not successful. So yes, in particular, it focuses on issues of sustainable development and environmental protection, and is much more effective at focusing on environmental protection. I think I talk about it later, but the Arctic is mostly an ocean. Obviously, it's terrestrial as all, but in terms of the 8 Arctic states cooperating, they have a common ocean or common seas that they need to deal with, and those lend themselves well to cooperating because there's no boundaries really that the ocean respects. On issues of sustainable development, it becomes much harder for Russia, say in Finland or Norway and Canada, to have common ground on issues of development. They just simply have totally different contexts, and so there aren't a lot of common denominators. For example, if you want to improve education or improve health, it's just basically, really different situations, and the Arctic Council doesn't really have any money by which to fund, say, social programming. And the last thing I'll say, just as a brief overview, the Arctic Council in the Ottawa Declaration said it should normally meet every 2 years. So every 2 years, roughly, there is a ministerial meeting. Right now, as I mentioned, Finland is chairing it, so so the Arctic Council's been around since 1996. So everyone had their turn. Everyone has had their 2 years, and then Canada, the United States, and now Finland are the first 3 that are having their second turn of 2 years. There's some good things about having a 2-year term is that engages all the countries at some point in a relatively short term. All the countries have to be engaged and think about the Arctic. And the other problem on the flip side is that it becomes very chairmanship driven. And so, Canada wanted to make a splash, United States wanted to make a splash. Now Finland wants to make a splash, and Iceland's already preparing their agenda. And so the chairman can sometimes kind of usurp the Arctic Council, and so it takes away some of the seamlessness and some of the continuity, which is why people are talking now that they really need a longer term strategic plan. And the only formal direction that the Arctic Council ever gets is in these ministerial declarations. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it later, but there have been, I do mention it later, a handful of agreements have come through the Arctic Council, and they're usually announced at these ministerials. Any questions? Otherwise, I'll keep going here. So if you didn't know, here are the members. So there are 8 Arctic states. It's interesting. In the 70s, I'll say there was some talk of Arctic 5 kinds of issues, and the one agreement that preceded the Arctic Council that was Arctic related was the 1973 Polar Bear Agreement, and that was an Arctic 5 agreement. So the ones that actually have territory with the Arctic Ocean per se. So that'd be Denmark because of Greenland, Canada, Russia, Norway, not least because of Svalbard, and the United States because of Alaska. And it was only in the 1980s, and then early 1990s that when people were talking about developing an Arctic Forum, that people thought Iceland, Sweden, and Finland should be included. And a lot of the impetus for that was kind of what was happening in the Barents region and denuclearizing kind of the Murmansk area and the Kola Peninsula, where Russia had been storing a lot of their nuclear material, and it was having a lot of environmental impact, specifically in Finland and Norway, and a little bit on Sweden. And so, and then Gorbachev in the 80s, and we'll talk about this, said that we could have an Arctic zone of peace. And so Finland really took up that initiative, the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy in 1991. And then that just translated into the Arctic Council. So it's a little quirk of history that the Arctic Council is an Arctic 8 forum rather than an Arctic 5 forum, which it could easily have been. And the Arctic 5 states still occasionally do some things on their own when it is specifically an Arctic Ocean issue. And then, Finland and Sweden, for example, don't have a coastline on the Arctic Ocean. And Iceland, kind of half claims it does and half claims, that it's in the North Atlantic, and probably would like to be part of an Arctic 6, but that hasn't happened. And then we have, I'm not a huge fan of this slide, even though I think it comes right from the Arctic Council, because it talks about permanent observers and ad hoc observers. Really, there are just observers, and then there's some, people who don't have kind of formal observer recognition yet. In practice, and then there's a big deal in the mid-2000s when the Arctic started to get hotter. Then China applied for observer status, and then South Korea, Japan, Singapore, some European states, the European Union. And there was a lot of interest and anxiety over who is an observer, who is an ad hoc observer. The EU still isn't a permanent observer. First of all, was Canada saying no, because the seal, they're banned on the seal hunt. And after they seem to have resolved some of that, then Russia said, actually, no, we aren't interested in the EU being part of this. But in practice, it doesn't matter because, even the EU will still sit down on working group meetings. Those observers have literally no power under the terms of the Ottawa Declaration, and mostly just participate, in the science and the research side, which is perfectly welcome and normal and acceptable. And again, I think it goes back to this misunderstanding of what the Arctic Council does, that the Asian states, maybe in particular, thought they wanted to have an influence on how the Arctic was divided, or how fishing occurred, or how shipping occurred, that they would use the Arctic Council as a means to press their interests, when in fact those issues are not explicitly dealt with at the Arctic Council. There are better venues, such as the International Maritime Organization, or kind of ad hoc agreements to deal with those issues. So So observers don't really have much power at all. But it has been an interesting trend to see non-Arctic states want to become more involved in the Arctic. So just a little bit more about who the players are in the Arctic Council. So you have a chair, which again I mentioned rotates between ministerials and usually lasts about 2 years. The reason I have to say usually is because the Norwegian chairmanship in 2006 to 2009 was just over 2.5 years, just because of kind of a blip in being able to schedule the ministerial. All the ones have been pretty much between 22 and 25 months. Then you have senior Arctic officials. So you may have heard about them. So each of the 8 Arctic states appoints a senior diplomat. It's often at an ambassador level, but not necessarily, who acts as a senior Arctic official. And they really kind of run, if you could use that word, the Arctic Council on a day-to-day basis. So the minister kind of swoops in on the day of the ministerial, but the people who kind of know what's happening there and negotiate all these things on a day-to-day basis are the senior Arctic officials. Their counterparts with the Indigenous organizations, and I have the list of the 6 of them there, are called heads of delegation. And that might be an executive director or a political chief of these organizations. It is interesting how these 6 Indigenous organizations came to be the permanent participants. And it was obviously a novel thing back in the 1990s to even have a category for Indigenous organizations. And many people, including myself, will say this is one of the real innovations of the Arctic Council, is the way in how it really authentically engages and includes Indigenous groups. But there's a lot of difference between those 6 groups. So the original ones were the first 3 listed there, the Inuit, Raypon, the Russian Association, and the Sami Council. And these 3 organizations existed outside of the Arctic Council, preceded the Arctic Council. And so they do quite a lot of other kind of advocacy work, lobbying, organizational work, and have mandates outside of international affairs. And then, but after 1996, then the Aleut, the Athabaskan, and the Gwich'in wanted to become involved. And so these 3, the second 3, the AIA, AAC, and GCI, were developed to represent those groups on the Arctic Council. So they have kind of that singular purpose of being the international arm of those Indigenous ethnic groups on the Arctic Council. And that means that they're much smaller, they don't have as much capacity, they don't have as big of a budget. And so there's a real difference between how powerful and how able each of the 6 permanent participants is to participate in Arctic Council activities. As the Arctic Council grew, between kind of 2006, 2007 to today, in the number of the activities and the pressures on it and the expectations, especially the 3 smaller permanent participants have had a real hard time keeping up. There are probably international meetings, once a month in far-flung places. It's expensive to travel. It's very time-consuming to travel. It deals with a lot of technical issues, which would be hard for 10 different people. To have the expertise to participate on all the other task forces and working groups and SAO meetings, let alone, the usual 1 executive director, maybe 2 people that they send to the meetings. And so sometimes they do have to be selective in what projects they do participate in. And then the observers, I had the map before, a third are non-Arctic states, a third are intergovernmental organizations, and a third are NGOs. And just as an interesting aside, Greenpeace has applied several times, but Greenpeace, along with the EU, is another one that's kind of always the bridesmaid, never the bride, and not officially an observer. And then the real work, when you say, what does the Arctic Council do? It mostly does research and science, and that mostly happens in its working groups. I think I have a slide on that coming up. And again, this was inherited from 1991 Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy, which had, I think, 4 working groups, again, on environmental protection or flora and fauna. And then when the Arctic Council was established in 1996, Canada said we need to have a sustainable development working group. So that was a new one added. And then the Arctic Contaminants Action Program was initially a program and then eventually became a working group itself. So now there are 6 working groups. And that's just another visualization of it, I guess. So there are the working groups. They're listed. probably if you, this is interesting if you're interested in kind of an organizational theory. How do these working groups all come to be? They all have widely different structures, widely different mandates, histories, and funding. So they are not kind of legally incorporated as subsidiaries of the Arctic Council. They are incorporated or structured depending on, you know, who's hosting them and what their history has been. So AMAP has been historically funded by Norway. It has probably a budget of about $2 million, sometimes more depending on projects. So it's definitely the richest working group, and you know, kind of has to follow Norwegian laws, and has no legal obligation or no structural obligation to report to the Arctic Council per se. Obviously it does, but it is structured as its own independent organization, as are the other ones. So I think CAF and PAIN maybe are based out of Iceland, if someone knows, and Canada usually hosts a sustainable development working group, but again, doesn't have a $2 million budget, doesn't have the same capacity in the same office as say AMAP would have. So and then ACAP is just, you know, has always been kind of small. Some of them are I think ACAP and EPPR, I think, are just kind of tagged on to the Arctic Council Secretariat in Tromsø. So it's just interesting, like the PPs, maybe even like the Arctic states, there's a huge variation in what the 6 working groups can each accomplish, their capacity, their funding, and their structure. And it makes it very hard to centralize any Arctic Council activities, because it's not for the Arctic Council chair or the director of the Secretariat to have these people or these projects report to them. That at the end of the day, if they want to do something that that the Arctic Council SAOs don't want them to do, they would, you know, they're legally capable of doing that. So it's just very interesting. Usually their chair follows, might follow the Arctic Council chairmanship, might follow its own kind of rotation, and often they have an executive secretary that kind of does the day-to-day running. Mostly scientists, researchers. Often there'll be government experts who try to calculate, you know, how much does the Arctic Council cost? And it was an impossible question to ask. You could easily find out how much the Arctic Council Secretariat gets from the Arctic states. That was an easy one to ask. But then to start to calculate what the working groups get from each state, so much of it is in kind, because they're just using government bureaucrats or scientists as their own scientists. And so it's a matter of, and if someone's working on Arctic contaminants, he says that, you know, is that 100% of their job is for Arctic Council working group, or is it 50% because they would be working on kind of their national Arctic contaminants anyways? So it becomes very impossible to kind of identify who, how much works for the Arctic Council or for a working group. And there's been some notable works that have kind of gotten kind of worldwide scientific attention. The Arctic Climate Impact Assessment is probably the most notable work of the Arctic Council. That was in 2004. And if you remember, Bush was president of the United States then, and even under the Bush administration, though, it was very clear, and the U.S. was on board, that, you know, the climate was changing in the Arctic, that it was serious and it was man-made, human-driven. And so that was kind of one of the earliest kind of watertight scientific consensus documents put forward by states that said, indeed, yes, the climate was changing. And then the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment in 2009 led pretty clearly to the Polar Code. And so that was a very influential document policy-wise. The Polar Code governs shipping in the polar regions. Now, so as I mentioned before, the working groups can be quite independent and can kind of act as their own subsidiaries. And so there became an issue for the Arctic Council. What if they wanted something specific done? Or what if they, you know, they wanted something that cut across working groups, and maybe the working groups were siloed a little bit and didn't always cooperate well, although sometimes they do. And so the Arctic Council developed in about 2009, I think, task forces. And these are meant to be kind of ad hoc, short term, usually either one chairmanship or two chairmanship terms with a concrete outcome, desired goal at the end of it. And so as you can see, there's been a task force on Arctic marine cooperation right now, or connectivity in the Arctic. In the past, almost all the agreements, the 3 agreements that the Arctic Council has come up with, have come out of a task force. So there's been one on Arctic marine oil pollution prevention. That was a task force to come up with that agreement. There's a framework on black carbon and methane that came out of a task force. The task force on search and rescue led to a search and rescue agreement, and the enhancing scientific cooperation led to an agreement on kind of improving the mobility of scientists and scientific equipment across the Arctic. So those are quite practical and quite, I would say, institutionally successful in that they're kind of concrete, they're short term, and they lead directly to kind of a desired goal. So it's been an interesting way for the Arctic Council to deal with some of its path dependence with the working groups, to do something a little more kind of institutionally responsive. Oh, sorry, I missed that one. It's just the Circumpolar Business Forum led to the Arctic Economic Council. So it was an agreement, but kind of a separate but related organization that doesn't, again, necessarily report to the Arctic Council, but is intended to have a close collaboration with them. So a little bit of the history I mentioned a little bit before, so I'll come through this quickly. Throughout the Cold War, if you kind of look back at the history of Arctic relations, from a European perspective, it's very much kind of the exotic. There was expeditions there. It was a place of adventure, a place of danger, and kind of this idea of kind of an icy, white, distant, exotic place. And then in international affairs, it was really just kind of a theater for the European powers, either economically with the fur trade, and then later in World War II, the Japanese, for example, invaded a few of the Aleutian Islands, and then so that brought attention to kind of this wing of the United States in particular, but of everybody that was left unguarded. And then they had the Cold War. It became very much, a strategic area between potential nuclear war between the United States and Russia, that the nuclear weapons would just go overhead. That would be the most likely route. And so we needed kind of air defense. And so that's how the Arctic was perceived. And then it was only in the 70s, there became a bit more, 60s and 70s, some more international indigenous collaboration, which, the creation of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference in the 70s, some Arctic Winter Games were occurring. There was more scientific cooperation. There was the Polar Bear Agreement, which I mentioned. And so even during the Cold War, some more Arctic-specific international collaboration started to occur, but it was not state-led. And then finally in 1987, Gorbachev has what, if you're an Arctic expert, is a very famous speech, the Mermaid speech, calling for the Arctic as a zone of peace. And this really opened up the possibility of having more formal state-led cooperation in the Arctic, where people could address kind of their common concerns, which were mostly environmental. And so there's just a short history there. I mentioned some of that. The Americans in particular were not that interested. They were coming out of a time where they were a bit more isolationist, not as interested in multilateral organizations, not interested in funding more multilateral or international fora. And so that's why really the Ottawa Declaration and the structure of the Arctic Council is quite weak institutionally. And so, for better and for worse. And here's a few of the milestones. I mentioned some of these. Secretariat was a temporary one, was established in 2009. That was kind of the brainchild of Norway, but along with Denmark and Sweden, and then made permanent in 2013. And that's made a big difference to the strength of the institution, that there's now, it's not just the chairman that kind of keeps the institutional memory, but there's a more neutral location for that, more professional staff, more continuity, and a few agreements in the past couple of years, which has which again was a maturity of the Arctic Council, that it was, even though it is not treaty based, and so it cannot monitor, those agreements aren't of the Arctic Council, they're under the auspices of the Arctic Council, and the agreements are between the 8 Arctic states technically. But it was again a maturity that the Arctic Council could facilitate some international collaboration that was a little bit more formal. And now, thinking about what it's going to do in the future. So some of the key challenges for the Arctic Council, from my perspective, and ones that people often report, the first is this lack of predictable and adequate funding. And so if you think, so like I said, I try to do the math of, all the work of the working groups, the meetings, the permanent participants, the secretariat, and then, roughly you could say probably between 15 and 20 million is what all of the Arctic Council work costs. And that's not a lot of money. And I think in Canada, if it's supposed to tackle sustainable development, just the territory of Nunavut gets over $1 billion from the government of Canada as a federal transfer. So you think, what is it that the Arctic Council can do with between $15 and $20 million to tackle Arctic climate change, black carbon and methane, sustainable development, challenges of, Indigenous relations in kind of a colonial context, shipping, other environmental protection, oil and gas monitoring. Obviously an organization with the capacity that 20 million buys you can't do all these things. And even though there's lots of great ideas, there's always ideas for new projects, food security or mental health or monitoring different contaminants. There's just not a lot. States pick and choose what they want to fund. And it's often based on their national interest. People still talk about if and how there's meaningful representation of Indigenous peoples, and I don't think there's an international organization that does it better than the Arctic Council, that does have that meaningful inclusion, that a lot of the states do try to fund their participation, their travel, but there's always going to be a capacity issue, and we're talking about small groups living in remote areas. It'll always be hard for them to find the expertise to sit on technical groups. Just as similarly, it'll be hard for states and observers to find, kind of people who are cognizant of traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. So there's a capacity issue on both sides. So that's always a question. There's always a question of how better to fund the permanent participants and to fund them more equally, and so that the 6 of them have more equal chance to participate. There's still the question, this one's still very much outstanding, of how to represent Northerners and kind of Northern subnational states. And I've listed, a few here. All the countries have subnational polities. What role does Greenland or Alaska or Northwest Territories have to play? So there's been very concerted effort to include Indigenous peoples in the Arctic Council, not wanting things to be kind of state capital centered, sovereign centered kinds of policies. But then, some of the Arctic that doesn't even have Indigenous peoples, like Iceland, and other parts have a significant non-Indigenous population. I think across the Arctic, probably about 8 to 10% of the population is Indigenous, and so you're dealing with the vast majority of Northerners are non-Indigenous. How are their voices incorporated? Can the federal and the central states do a good job of representing their interests, or should these kind of other subnational organizations be involved? Greenland, in fact, refused to attend one of the Arctic Council ministerials as part of the Danish delegation. They wanted to be there as part of their own delegation, and refused to attend when that wasn't going to work for them. Meaningful inclusion of observers. People always say, how can we better incorporate the non-Arctic states and make them feel more engaged and enable them to contribute better? Not all the Arctic states want them to be able to contribute better, and usually, frankly, it's Canada and Russia that would prefer to just keep it as an Arctic thing, and a lot of issues. Obviously, there's East-West dynamics, and maybe always, certainly in the last 3 years, the idea of can the West continue to work with Russia? Can Russia continue to work with the West in the Arctic when we're having such terrible difficulties collaborating in other international affairs in arena? And so there's always the concern, it's very legitimate, that at some point our issues with Russia are going to spill over into the Arctic Council. And people have worked so hard, very hard in the last 5 years, as I said before, to compartmentalize them. And the last Arctic Council chairmanship in Fairbanks was, kind of a miracle, really, that it really could have gone sideways. It really could have just been derailed. And yet the foreign ministers were all laughing, smiling, had very frank, interesting discussions. I saw Tillerson and Lavrov like they were like best friends, which is, maybe also a little bit concerning. Maybe it isn't. But it was remarkable how resilient the Arctic Council was to what are otherwise, terrible East-West dynamics. It's interesting if anyone watches kind of international affairs also that Finland has made bringing the Arctic heads of state together a part of its chairmanship agenda, and that hasn't happened, probably isn't going to happen. Bring 8 Arctic heads of state, but kind of in lieu of, as you guys know, they hosted Putin and Trump. And if you look at the Finnish messaging, this was very much about the Arctic and about trying to establishing groundwork to deal with black carbon together. And they had the Arctic Council was there, and the chairmanship had their own room to talk about Arctic challenges. And it's almost bizarre to me that they couldn't foresee that it'd be totally overshadowed by the kind of these other geopolitical issues. But very much Finland was trying to position itself as kind of a neutral mediator and position the Arctic as that that unique area in the world where we can all get along and where we have work to do together. Continuity in its work has been an issue. Accountability of what it does. So the ministerial declarations may say lots of nice things, or the projects might call for many recommendations, and no one ever goes back and says, did we do what we said we would do in 2009? Did we do what we said we would do in 2012? And so there isn't a lot of accountability. So lots of people will kind of accuse it of just being kind of ministerial fluff and rhetoric, and there's no indication of really what the impact is. So we could certainly do some more on the accountability side. The question of should it have a regional or a global focus? And this was kind of the whole observer issue. Should the Arctic Council be a place where non-Arctic states and Southerners have a voice in the Arctic, where you conceive of the Arctic as this common heritage of mankind, where we all have a role, we all have a responsibility to help preserve it? Or is the Arctic Council for Northerners, where Northern issues should take priority in Northern, policies and desires, and where's the balance between, non-Arctic people having a say in what happens in the region, and Northerners, traditionally being excluded from having a say in what happens in their own region, maybe having, being able to have the lion's share of the voice in 2018. So that's always an issue. There's the inherent tension between the environment and development, and the Arctic Council generally tries to be agnostic on that. It doesn't prescribe economic development, or it certainly doesn't try to stop economic development either. These are national level decisions. If you want to drill for oil or open a mine, that is none of the Arctic Council's business. It would never make state an opinion on that. And so what it's tried to do is just provide kind of best practices and common guidelines for all the 8 Arctic states to follow when there is development. Again, it's institutionally weak based on what was in the actual Ottawa Declaration in 1996. And it's still struggling to move from kind of a policy shaping, where it really has been successful is in establishing norms and values around Indigenous inclusion, around precautionary principle, around collaboration and compartmentalization, despite spillover of tensions elsewhere, and trying to move to a policy making where it has more institutional teeth, more of a legal kind of character. And it's been struggling in that, but it's done some things in that area. What it is not, it's not a governing authority. It's not primarily intended to address climate change. That's not, was not really the focus of its mandate, and still isn't. But in the South or mainstream media, it'll often be portrayed as an organization meant to address Arctic climate change, because people have a hard time thinking of the Arctic in any terms other than climate change terms. It doesn't, as I just mentioned, govern resource development or shipping. It doesn't mediate border disputes. It might be useful that the senior Arctic officials all know each other and have good relations, and the foreign ministries have contacts because of the Arctic Council. That's certainly been a big help. But when it comes to kind of these bilateral issues, those will be done totally separately. The Arctic Council will not have an opinion on those. Russia is fully included. It is in the 7+1 group. Russia is a key partner, and that's withstood, you know, a lot of the challenges that you think, you know, that's surprising, and has withstood all that. Observers are not members per se. They don't vote. They don't have as much power. So it's really still about the Arctic Aid and the permanent participants. And the Arctic Council is not the only regional Arctic governmental forum. There's probably a dozen different governmental fora to deal with Arctic issues. And it's 10:41. So I just wanted to jump ahead to strategic planning, and if you guys have any opinions on this, knowing what we know, knowing what the challenges are, what do we think, or how do you think the Arctic Council should evolve to meet the challenge of the 21st century? Should it have a whole new auto declaration, a whole new terms of reference? Should it be a treaty-based organization? Should it deal with military security? Should it deal just with climate change? Should it have a bigger budget? Who should be, you know, should different people be members of it? And then the question I think the Arctic Council is asking itself, if form follows function, so we can change it, you know, some could change the terms of reference, certainly, or the structure of the funding. But first you need to determine the function. What is it that the Arctic Council should do? What is it that it is uniquely positioned to do that, you know, states can't do unilaterally or bilaterally or through other fora? What is that gap that, you know, requires an Arctic Council, and what it should fill? So that's where I'm going to leave it now. I have about 15 minutes, you know, to chat about it or ask further questions if I've gone too fast on some of these. So I'll open up the floor now.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. That was really exciting. And I think even people who know the Arctic Council somewhat certainly have learned one or the other new things here. And people who are not that familiar with the Arctic Council, they certainly had a very intense introduction into the subject matter. And if I may start out with a very first question, maybe to warm up the discussion, Heather, would you say that basically its institutional weakness, or the perceived weakness, is also a key advantage to staying unharmed, you know, untouched, and withstanding any of the major geopolitical shifts, and whether that can be also seen as a key advantage of the Arctic Council?
Absolutely. I don't think it would have survived. So there was a lot of so there's an intense period after 2009, kind of 2010, when Arctic experts look at it, historians or political scientists. 2007 was really a watershed year. That was the year that the Russians planted the titanium flag in the Arctic Pole, in the North Pole, and the Canadian Prime Minister said, you know, use it or lose it, and announced a ton of investments in the Arctic. People started to realize that the sea ice was melting, so all of a sudden shipping was becoming possible. So there was a real flurry of activity after that. First of all, people kind of being defensive, and then saying, oh no, this is a cooperative area. And so demonstrating in 2009, 10, 11, 12, all these new kinds of cooperations on fishing. One of them was military chiefs of defense. And also something I haven't mentioned, which is really important, is an Arctic Coast Guard Forum, which came out of that search and rescue agreement. And these are, you know, it's tremendous to think that in 2015, a year after Crimea, the 8 Arctic states got together and had an Arctic Coast Guard Forum with 8 states, so including Russia. And so how did that even, it's still a mystery to me. You know, it's still a mystery how they were able to do that, convince themselves, when in almost every other domain, the kind of bilateral or multilateral kind of peace exercises, defense diplomacy exercises that people had with Russia were delayed or suspended. And this Arctic chiefs, they met twice. Military chiefs of the Arctic states met twice, and then that collaboration was suspended after Crimea. But the Arctic Coast Guard Forum still went on, and all these other things still go on. So it is, to me, a miracle. that cooler heads keep prevailing when it comes to the Arctic. Because, and for me, why is that? It's just because we're all so nice. No, states are not nice. It's because they have common interests there. And Russia has a lot of icebreakers. And when you're in the Arctic, whoever's the closest ship needs to come, and it still might be a couple of days. So, so first of all, it's because they explicitly say that we're not going to deal with those hard issues. They can talk about, the mom and pop kinds of issues, apple pie issues that everyone likes. No one ever gets mad. There's no competition. There is no zero-sum game with environmental protection. If your neighbor has very strict environmental protection, that helps you. You don't compete with that neighbor. So there are absolute gains considered instead of relative games, which in international politics means that it's not as competitive. It allows for a more cooperative atmosphere. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting dynamics, which was why I'm interested in the Arctic. Is you have to ask yourself, like, how is this happening? How is this even possible? And I didn't mention this before, but a group of about 40 of us academics nominated the Arctic Council for a Nobel Peace Prize in January, and I don't think they'll win it, but it's kind of a nice media thing. But it's to say, like, there's something different happening here, and there's many different contributing factors. But it is an anomaly in international politics, especially right now.
Well, thank you very much. We do have 3 questions, and I will just start with Tuli. Tuli, I'll unmute you, and I hope that you're in a location where you can talk. Otherwise, please type in the question, but you should be able to talk now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation or this starting keynote speech. Actually, greetings from Finland. We have met once. I'm one of Lassi Heininen students.
Yes, I recall. And yeah. I remember you were working with Seniors Health. Is that right? Geriatric health?
Sorry?
We met on the Kellogg Academy, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, 2014. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, great. So this was something really interesting for me because I am writing my master's thesis about the Arctic Council and its climate policy. And of course, I would like to discuss a bit more about climate policy, but this time I would like to ask you, how do you see the Arctic Council's role? Because I think that it brings key issues to international or global fora. If you think, for example, climate change or a POP issue. So those issues which were very important, for example, for indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. So then the Arctic Council was active and brought them to the bigger fora.
So great question. I might have an unpopular answer. So you're very right that the Arctic states and indirectly the Arctic Council have played a big role in some of the bigger international environmental agreements, like persistent organic pollutants and mercury. Because often, as you would know, the Arctic acts as a sink for these kinds of things. It's not my area of expertise, but it's talked about a lot in the Arctic. When it comes to climate policy, again, people often associate it's the Arctic Council, therefore climate change must be part of what it does, and it is. But when I try to think of what is that niche that the Arctic Council should fill, for me, climate policy is mostly a global level problem. And so people will make a joke that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And for me, it's what happened outside the Arctic didn't stay outside the Arctic. It all went right to the Arctic. So it's what's happening in kind of the south or between the, I don't know what the latitudes are, but between 60 and 60 in the middle is affecting what's happening at the poles. And so how we address climate change has to be directed by what happens in the mid latitudes. And so what can the Arctic Council do? There's some advocacy, certainly, that I think that you're indicating. It has to do mitigation because it's already happening in the Arctic. So collectively, are there ways that Russia and Canada and Alaska and Norway, for example, can address melting permafrost or kind of the impacts of sea ice melting together, of mitigating that? But addressing climate policies, for me, mostly a climate thing. The one exception is black carbon. And again, I'm not a scientist. This isn't and this is what the Arctic Council is focused on. But that is more of a specific short-term regional level kind of policy that can mitigate climate change, is addressing black carbon. And so reducing coal burning or wood burning or things like that, cleaning up industrial activity so that it doesn't, the black carbon gets on the white snow and then the white snow melts faster and so on and so forth. So in general, my feeling is that the Arctic Council should focus maybe on mitigation of climate change, but that but dealing with climate change is mostly a global issue, and it can't be done. People will say, oh, with the Arctic Council, with the 8 Arctic members and all the observers, it accounts for 63% or something of all our carbon emissions. And that's that China isn't going to the Arctic Council to deal with how it's going to mitigate its carbon, I don't think. Anyway, so that's my unpopular opinion, that the Arctic Council's niche may be better served focusing on more region-specific issues rather than global-specific issues.
And I have heard that, for example, Annika Nilsson has used the word cognitive forerunner, so that the niche of the Arctic Council is to produce the scientific evidence about the climate issue and so on.
I think she's probably right, and you're probably right, that it has been pretty effective in that, and that there is, collaboration around monitoring. And people get startled. It is newsworthy, and people get shocked and startled when they see, the sea ice, evolve from 1979, and that there are important monitoring and communicative kinds of roles that the Arctic states obviously can share, and it's better if they do it together. So I think you're right, and it's not 100% either all climate change or no climate change. I just think it should deal less with climate change than the majority of people think that it should deal with climate change.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. The others are waiting for their turn.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Julie. And I'm really glad you could ask these questions. And now I want to give the microphone to Dario. Dario, if you're in a place where you can talk, you can ask your question now.
Yes, I hope you can hear me right. Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. We also actually had a pleasure to meet. It was in the fall of 2014, the Arctic Circle. I was a master's student, but I was researching about sort of the Canadian opening to the East Asian observers in the midst of a really strong nationalistic rhetoric by the Harper's government. Used to lose it, how that rhetoric could go along with China and Japan going to the Arctic.
Yeah, that's great. Did the Canadian SAO walk by us? And I think when I was kind of slamming Canadian policy.
Yeah, no, but so thank you very much for your presentation. I actually wanted to ask a couple of things. The first was what do you think is the role of, for example, the Arctic Circle, which is a really sort of really fluid, really fluid forum, if you think institutionally wise, which brings together a sort of huge variety of stakeholders. And when I was there was a cruising firm and exploring the possibility of cruising in the Arctic, and then there's Chinese stakeholders, Japanese, South Korean. So you sure know about this. So I was thinking, I wanted to know what do you think is the role of such fora, which are really sort of informal? Could they have a complementary role or a competitive role? Thinking about the Arctic Council's work. And the second question is, what do you think is the role of the Arctic Economic Council for promoting economic development in the Arctic? Because I remember you voicing your opinion that there's really not much happening when it comes to economic development in the Arctic, and there's a lack of strong academic research on that. So I was wondering, do you think the Arctic Economic Council could be the right forum for sort of fostering economic development in the Arctic as an issue that brings together all the stakeholders?
Two great questions. On the first one, I have lots of opinions on the role of the Arctic Council, but I do know there's a Norwegian, Andreas, you probably know her, Beatty Spavik, I think, but she just did her PhD on looking at it. So that would be, if you're interested in that. But anyways, but my opinion is no, it was always captured as a competitive, as it was spreading the Arctic Council. But organizationally, they couldn't be different. They play two totally different roles. One is an intergovernmental forum, and one is a conference. And so for me, there's no competition. There's totally different roles. Whether they're complementary or not, it's hard to say. This is how I see the Arctic Council. it's very globally oriented, and you've indicated that yourself. So there'll be China country sessions or Germany country sessions or France, or they'll have the UN. And so whereas the Arctic Council probably to me is leaning more to the regional focus and really dealing with more with people issues, I think the Arctic Circle sees the Arctic as a global heritage, as a common heritage of all mankind. And the people who go there see it in that way also. And so the focus will be on, $1 trillion ocean, instead of thinking about, how to have telehealth or how to improve schools. The scale and the scope is at the highest, whereas a lot of Arctic issues need to be very kind of dealt at the most local, regional level. So I think that's interesting. I've also noticed, is just, my opinion, how it's become a forum for subnational entities, like think Quebec, Faroe Islands, Scotland, Alaska, to kind of position themselves outside of the state system in international affairs, and Iceland itself kind of as a microstate, having been pushed out of the Arctic 5 to say there's other places where I can be a player on the international stage. So that isn't necessarily an Arctic thing, but it's become an interesting aspect of the Arctic Circle, of the kind of non-traditional international relations space that's opened up for people. But to sum up, I don't think it's competitive. I think it has a completely different role. The Arctic states, depending on the year, think that it's a very important forum that they should all be at, or just kind of refuse to go at all. Sometimes they've booked their SAO meetings at the exact same time as the Arctic Circle. And so there's a real schizophrenia amongst, I think, the Arctic states of how to deal with this. But undoubtedly it's an important epistemic kind of community forum for the Arctic. And I go every year because I see everybody I ever need to see in the Arctic in Reykjavik every year. So I've made it a priority for myself. On the question of the Arctic Economic Council, that's such a good question. And yes, it is. Arctic economic development is so complicated. And so is it the $1 trillion ocean? And is it China shipping, to Amsterdam? Is it, $10 billion oil and gas projects? Is that what we're talking about? Or is it, there's poverty amongst Indigenous peoples and the educational attainment rates are very low, and it's hard to have, you have to import, and food is very expensive, and there aren't a lot of the service industry, and the knowledge economy is very underdeveloped. And so these are two totally different things, and people conflate them. And so what is it that the Arctic Economic Council is going to do? And so far I can see that it's institutionally very weak, because it doesn't have a lot of stakeholders, doesn't have a lot of champions or ambassadors. Right now, as you probably know if you're Finnish, the Finnish president, who's the president of the ice breaking company, I can't remember right now, Tero Verosti, he's obviously become the ambassador, and the champion is the face of it. And before him was Tara Sweeney from Alaska. And outside of those two ambassadors, I would have a hard time, and I follow it closely to tell you what it does or how it does it. And they're saying, coming out and saying we need to have international trade, that Trump is affecting trade in the Arctic. And that seems to me a funny place to focus your attention on when most of the Arctic states, other than Russia, can already freely trade amongst each other anyways. But anyway, so it's not, so I think it will have a hard time figure out what level, what scope to deal with, the $1 trillion ocean kind of stuff, or the kind of micro development stuff in Indigenous communities. And it will have demands to address both or all levels of those development. And that's an impossible task for anybody, let alone a small organization with, let's assume, a $200,000 budget. So do I have high hopes for it? No, because billions and tens of billions of dollars have gone into trying to promote economic development in the Arctic, and to no success. And as you pointed out, this is my nerdy side story. I know I'm running out of time. I got all these, 1970s books on economic development in Canada for my summer reading. And I can tell you, and I'll probably write a blog about it, our understanding of Northern economic development has not improved one iota since the 1970s. We are still saying the exact same things. It's trying to incorporate Indigenous peoples, thinking maybe about tourism, thinking about being, on the shipping route, as like not a single thing has changed. The field is dead. And I don't know, can you guys name any Arctic economists? I can name 3. I can name only 3 Arctic economists. And so you have people like me who are political scientists trying to guess at economic development issues. And that's what's been happening for the last 40 years. So good luck to the AEC, but there isn't the capacity, there isn't the talent, the expertise out there to inform what they do.
Thank you very much for your answers.
Thanks.
Yeah, and thank you, Heather. And we're almost out of time. Technically, we are already, but Andreas Kramer, you also had a question. And I wanted to give you the opportunity. And Heather, if you can answer this.
Yes, I have it here,
quickly.
so I can quickly answer it. I thought at the Fairbanks, Andreas, sorry, I can read your question here to save time. I thought at Fairbanks and leading up to it after Trump, I thought this is going to be.
Heather, but you have to read the question. One of you has to read the question out because the participants can't read this. So,
It's the sense of the impact of the Trump presidency on the Arctic Council. And is there common continuity as it appears on the outside, or is there more behind the scenes? And I was shocked at how much continuity there was at the Fairbanks ministerial. Would it have been any different if Kerry had been Secretary of State versus Tillerson? I don't think that ministerial declaration would have been any different. And that's a shocking thing to realize, that under a Clinton Kerry administration or a Barack Obama Kerry administration, the Arctic Council ministerial would have gone the same way as it did under Trump and Tillerson. So it's a shocking thing. And now I think the Americans, I don't think this Trump administration has the focus or the attention to think about the Arctic Council or Arctic issues. And I think the best strategy is no one tell them about the Arctic Council. Like keep it out of sight, out of mind, and the Trump presidency is going to resolve itself sooner than later. And that's why I thought the Helsinki summit was such a terrible idea, to bring Putin and Trump's laser focus onto the Arctic. Only bad things could happen. And I'm glad that, at the end, the Finns were unsuccessful, I think, and that no one really cared about the Arctic. That certainly wasn't Trump's focus. Trump is not going to start, or Putin, highlighting black carbon initiatives. That's not his base. That's not what his base wants to see anyways. So really, I think the best thing for the Arctic Council to do is, again, to hide itself, to compartmentalize itself, to keep on the down low. That served it very well in the past. And hopefully that'll be enough to get through the next 2 years, 6 years, whatever it is. All right, thank you very much, Max.
Well, thank you, Heather. And Andreas also said thank you. And I think that was a great last statement also. Wonderful presentation, wonderful discussion. We are past the hour, so we need to say goodbye to Heather. Heather, I look forward to seeing you then in Reykjavik, and we'll be in touch. Feel free to stay or leave if you are busy. Otherwise, we'll switch over to our next presenter. And Andreas, I'll just make you already a presenter so you can get ready with your screen while I introduce yourself. So Andreas, and I hope I say the last name right, probably not at all, Østhagen. He's a researcher at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute in Oslo. That's rather recently. Before you had different other positions, including now I got to rethink again, but you were at the CSIS, at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in DC in 1 year. And for a few years you were, or you still are, a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And you're also, and that's probably not coincidence that you know Heather, you're also linked to the Arctic Institute as a senior fellow and leadership group member there. And we'll actually have a third person, and of course Andreas Kramer is linked to the Arctic Institute as well, a link to the Arctic Institute in our last session, which will be Victoria Herrmann on August 29th. So it's a very strong presence here in our summer college. And Andreas, you have your slides ready. I think just a small comment, we can still see the navigation pane on the left, but otherwise we see the slides. It's all there. I wanted to also briefly mention your topic. but you have it already on your first slide, so there's nothing left for me to say there. If you're ready, then we're ready, and I'll mute myself and disappear. If there are any questions or trouble with the slides coming up, let me know. Just for everybody, so you know, this is now kind of a premiere in its own in technology. It's a Prezi presentation, so we'll see this working out. We did a trial run and it worked very nicely, and I hope it will work now in real time too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. Thank you for inviting me, first of all, and thank you for introducing myself and my numerous affiliations. Let me just try to get away the bar. Hope it's away now. Yes, it's Prezi. What do they say? If you have no point, use PowerPoint. So I'll try to do a better job with this. Although it's a bit difficult when you're sharing your screen like this, but we'll try. And yeah, as I said, thank you for introducing the Arctic Institute in particular. Victoria Herman will come at the end. It's actually a proposal, or an idea at least, to some of you who are listening. I'm not sure I know all of you, but I know some of you. But the Arctic Institute is actually the reason why so many of us are connected to it. It's because it's a network. So if you're interested in writing about the Arctic, or just learning more about the Arctic, or you know, doing some mostly volunteer work though, but getting more into the Arctic epistemic community, as Heather called it, then please just get in touch. But my regular job is actually here in Oslo at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute. So I will talk a bit about security, and security is it's a difficult topic because it can mean many things. So let's do the typical academic way of and qualifying what I'm actually talking about. So first of all, I'm not talking about human security, right? And if you are familiar with security as a field of study, then you know that there are more ways of interpreting security than just, you know, the traditional way that we think of the traditional, say, state or military security. But so important to note that, at least. But I'm going to focus on the former, so the military dimensions. Also very difficult to do that in 30 minutes, and also do it to cover everything. So I'll try to do more analysis and maybe more arguments than many facts and being descriptive. I assume some of you know it quite well already, or you could read online, you know, in Wikipedia, some of the things that I talk about. So I'll try to make a point or a couple of arguments instead. And I'm going to finish by talking about Canada and Norway's approaches to security in the Arctic, based on a recent study I did with a couple of colleagues. Also because I have a foot in both camps, so to speak, being Norwegian, being from, actually I'm from Bodø. Some say it's the most beautiful city in Norway, others don't. It's just above the Arctic Circle. But I also, as Max mentioned, I am studying in Canada, although I studied in Canada, not living there anymore. So let's dive into it. I hope you got some news clippings on your screen right now. This is just to highlight, you know, all the typical media attention that we're used to concerning the Arctic. And again, I don't know the backgrounds of everyone in this conversation, but you're probably familiar with some of this, right? These stories, they range from being from 2014 to 16 to 15, so a bit dispersed. But the point is, we've all seen the stories, right? The Arctic is melting, and because it's melting, the states are rushing up into the Arctic to claim, you know, the resources up there, or to have a great political, geopolitical confrontation in the Arctic. And this has been the rhetoric more or less since I got into Arctic studies, which is now 8-9 years ago. I did my master degree in 2009 on the Arctic, and that was really when it took off. I think Heather mentioned it as well, the flag planting back in 2007. The idea that, you know, the Russian flag planting on the seabed of the North Pole. Later on, you know, the flag flagger himself, Shiligadov, said this was more symbolic than anything else, but it caused a lot of attention to the Arctic. So even before tensions increased with Russia over Crimea and then Ukraine, there was a lot of talk about the scramble for the Arctic, right? And in a security sense, it was often at least some argued very early on, 2008, 2009, that the states around the Arctic Circle or the states around the Arctic Ocean would now engage in disputes over who has rights to the resources. So initially it was a resource-based argument, right? Conflict would emerge because there is a lot of oil and gas in the Arctic and minerals as well. Then I think a lot of scholars, some of my supervisors here in Norway, other scholars like Heather and a lot of people in Canada in particular, spent a lot of ink arguing against this, right? Arguing that, no, actually, if you look at the Arctic map, you look at where the resources are located, they're within the exclusive economic zones of the Arctic states, and they can barely develop them on their own anyway, right? The Chukchi sea drilling off the coast of Alaska hasn't taken off as was predicted back in 2010-11 when I was in DC. Similarly in Norway, right? In Norway, the haven for offshore oil and gas development, even we haven't been able to really develop the Barents Sea resources. There's only 2 operating wells, and they're barely breaking even. So I think eventually the whole security argument that you would have conflict over resources dispelled. And then it became more focused, although you still see it sometimes, it still pops up, but the oil price is low or lower. So today the focus is more on the larger geopolitics after Crimea. And again, the Arctic now is depicted as this region where you will have confrontation, head-to-head versus US versus Russia, China, right? Always the alluring presence in the background. These quick headlines concepting disputes and conflict in the Arctic. And again, you have a lot of scholars then who spend time disproving this or showing that these dynamics aren't actually true, like Heather said, right? And Heather's been one of the leading scholars within this, showcasing how the Arctic Council in particular, but the Arctic epistemic community at large, if you may, is actually causing or creating or has favored conditions for cooperation instead of direct conflict. So so this is another depiction, right? This is even from 2009, I think, in The Economist, right? Just highlighting this geopolitical rivalry. So for me, though, as a relatively young, not so young anymore maybe, but used to be a young Arctic scholar, I came into this and I realized very quickly there seemed to be almost 2 different storylines about the Arctic. One in particular used by the media, the other one used by scholars to an extent, but scholars always try, as you know, to be very nuanced. The other one, I would say, more used by foreign or governments in general, so foreign ministries. And it's fascinating if you read Lassi Heinen, as was mentioned, the supervisor to one of the people listening in. If you read, for example, Lassi Heinen's overview of the various Arctic policies, they're surprisingly identical, right? They all talk about sustainable development, they talk about respect for law of the sea, and they talk about cooperation, cooperation, and cooperation. So it's almost become this mantra to emphasize as a counterweight to this security conflict rhetoric, then foreign ministries and also scholars emphasize, no, actually in the Arctic, there's nothing to see, there's no problems. We actually we're in a unique case study of cooperation. The Arctic Council, as I said, being mentioned, as you heard from Heather, but also the Arctic 5 getting together in Ilulissat back in 2008, affirming UNCLOS. There's been talks about how do you follow up these things, and also very much emphasis on the good relationships. So you have this almost this maybe not a dichotomy, but at least 2, as I see it, narratives. And I would argue that both are true to an extent. And the reason why they're often depicted as dichotomous or in opposition to each other has to do with a problem with level of analysis. And so that's maybe the more academic argument that I'll be making. Maybe some of you are familiar with this concept, right? The blind men and an elephant, or I think in this photo more correctly, it's a woman as well. So the blind men and women trying to describe an elephant, all trying to describe what they see, but only depicting one part of the larger picture. And I sometimes feel that some of the Arctic debates are a bit similar, because people, academics, media, we love hating on media, right? But in general, people fall into categories. And one of the I guess the reasons I see behind this is a level of analysis problem. And I call it the IR problem. If you ever studied international relations, you know that this is very much debated and kind of tiring in the end. But I still think it's applicable when you look at Arctic security. So when you look at this idea that in the Arctic you are likely to have conflict because various numbers of reasons, right? Whether it's because resources are now suddenly more interesting, or it's because Russia and the US are squaring off somewhere else, and the Arctic is becoming a part of this. Whatever drives the conflict, I think you can disseminate it by looking at the various levels of analysis. So the systemic level, somewhat abstract, but if you're familiar with it, it depicts the international system, right? As states are more or less bound by the system that they are operating. You can argue that the less agency, less free will within the system, that inherently powerful states, great powers, superpowers are bound to have conflictual relationships, or at least are trying to do a relative power balance. So within this idea of thinking, the Arctic just becomes a theater of war, right? And the Arctic it's not necessarily because the Arctic has the resources on its own. It's more that the Arctic is one of the many, say, battlegrounds, if you may, or regions in the world where these great powers are, say, as it says in the article from 6 months ago, vying to compete. Right, so China is rising, Russia is there, and it's the largest Arctic state, and the US, of course, is superpower or the hegemon. So in the end, you have this competing race, and some scholars still make this argument, and I personally don't necessarily think that it's completely inaccurate. And I think you do see Rob Hubert, for example, in Calgary, in Canada, has been. I think some scholars, especially the scholars focusing on cooperation, like to laugh a bit about some of these depictions of the Arctic becoming more and more a region of competition when you see the opposite occurring. But I think he is onto something in the sense that Russia is investing in the region where they feel, say, the most at home, or it's the closest to home, or even near abroad. And it's becoming an area where China also is engaging. You can argue why China is engaging. Is it because of the economic interests, or as some say, even some Chinese scholars as well, it's because China is becoming a global superpower. So China needs to engage in various regions around the world, including the Arctic, because the Arctic is gaining attention generally globally. So then you see the systemic arguments, right? You see the reasons for why states are not necessarily clashing, but at least are, if you want, geopolitical in geopolitical competition in the Arctic. Although, is this security? More or less, right? Where do you draw the line? But at least you can argue that some of the investment, some of the military security discussions in the Arctic relates to this fact. But then you have a different level, right? Let's call it the state level, or the regional level, and then regional not as within states, but as the areas that states belong to regionally. And there you see, as Heather did a great job of explaining, and I don't need to go into that very well, the cooperation that is taking place in the Arctic through the Arctic Council. This picture, if you can see it, was during just before the Sochi Olympic Games. The Arctic states met at the North Pole and did a PR stunt, right? Because we're all friends in the Arctic. So this, I would say, is not necessarily in contrast with the first, or the systemic level of analysis, but it adds to it. And I think it's important to identify that and separate, and also recognize that you can have cooperation in the Arctic Council, but while at the same time have so-called global or regional competition between states. And then the final level, let's be honest, there's more levels in the world than this. It's a simplification, but an additional and third level of analysis, I think, would be to look at the domestic, the actors within each state, or the actors that operate transnationally between states. The picture I have here, if you don't recognize it, I won't blame you. It's on the border between, or it's a picture of the border between Russia and Norway, in Storskog, so the 197-kilometer long border that Norway and Russia shares. And if you look at people living in Kirkenes, have a daily connection to Russia, right? They travel across the border now and again and trade, and so there's people from Murmansk going into the Norwegian side. The same goes for Finland. The same goes for between Alaska and Chukotka. I mean, it's domestic interests, whether they might be economic or indigenous, that travel across the borders and interact with each other, and they might not share the same, say, perceptions or approach to security and military security in particular, as you see on a systemic level or even in the Arctic Council level. So my argument is that, and of course these levels they're not watertight sheds, right? They interact with each other. You can have, of course, happenings taking place on the systemic level interacts with what takes place at a domestic level. But I would argue that if you try to at least identify some of these levels and this interaction and try to separate it, you also get a clearer picture a bit of why the Arctic sometimes and still keeps being referred to as this new hotspot for global competition, while at the same time it's a unique case for regional cooperation. And at the same time you have all this trans-boundary trade and interaction as well. So I can't see you or your questions, so I'll just keep going, and you could take the questions at the end. Turning to one particular case study that I think is useful to highlight some of this, but also highlight security more generally, and then one of the levels. So if you look at the say the state level, the security of the state itself and its defense posture, and Norway and Canada, right? If you're familiar with any or both. Quite similar countries in many ways, right? Canada, of course, much bigger, much larger in terms of both population and size, but both are located far to the north. Naturally, they have a strong emphasis on the Arctic, but they also share other trade, highly developed countries, right? High on the Human Development Index, income equality is relatively low, very strong engagement in multilateral or the United Nations, UN peacekeeping, international organizations in general. It's interesting, not too long ago, or I guess it's 20 years ago actually, to the year that Norway and Canada here in Norway met and signed a declaration to ban landmines, right? And also emphasizing on human security, introducing human security as a new aspect in the United Nations. So to Norway and Canada, a lot of similarities. Then you look at security interests, however, and the picture starts to become a bit different. And especially for me, being a Norwegian and then living and studying and interacting in Canada, you quickly learn to realize that the whole security means something very different. And again, the key variable here, it's not rocket science, right? The key variable is Russia, right? Geographic proximity to Russia. Because if you grow up in North Norway, Russia is quite close as a neighbor, whereas in Canada it is not. Even though we tend to talk about the Arctic as one security region, right? We talk about it as one system, as I said earlier. We talk about it as one system where international actors are competing. But I would argue that actually, when in terms of hard security, military security, it is not so much the case. One example that really exemplifies what I'm trying to show with Canada and Norway is the discussion concerning NATO. NATO as a traditional security alliance, right? But NATO has never had an explicit policy for the Arctic. Of course, NATO is present in the Arctic by virtue of its member states. So NATO has, of course, plans for the Arctic. It has strategies for the Arctic, but never any policy document, never anything, spoken. And Norway, around 2006, 2007, we got a new government, a new foreign minister, Jonas Gahr Støre, was very engaged in the Arctic. Maybe it's similar to Stephen Harper in those respects. He launched, and his government launched, this idea that NATO need a specific policy for the Arctic. Exactly what this policy would contain, it's a bit hard to get a hold of, but they needed a more clear policy. And of course, this was related towards Russia, because Russia started around 2006 to increase its military activity in the Arctic. It started to reinvest in the Arctic for whatever reasons you can argue, whether it's due to protecting its economic interests, or whether it's due to reinvest in old Cold War equipment, or it's because Russia wants to become a great power again. Whatever rationale you find most convincing, there's a lot been written about that. I'm not going to take any clear stance, but the point is they started to reinvest, and the Norwegian reaction to this investment was, okay, we need to get NATO back or focused in the Arctic, because NATO used to be focused in the Arctic during the Cold War, and then NATO got more interested in out-of-area operations, fighting terrorism and other things. So Norway, together with Iceland to some extent, launched this idea, NATO back to the roots. And Canada, under Stephen Harper at that point, rejected this. Not only Canada, but Canada was one of the most vocal against this, saying there's no need for NATO in the Arctic. There's no purpose for NATO in the Arctic. And for me, this signifies, or this symbolizes exactly what I'm talking about, the differences in security outlook. Because if you are Canadian or Canadian defense planner, your main, or you talk about defense of homeland, right? Your main line of defense is NORAD. It's the bilateral defense alliance that Canada has informally and formally through NORAD with the US. And this protects the Canadian homeland and the Canadian Arctic as well. And it has been expanded in 2006, including a maritime dimension and an airborne dimension as well now recently. So NORAD is extremely important for Canada in terms of domestic defense. For Norway, though, of course, as I already mentioned, it is NATO. We have nothing else. We've been a NATO member since 1949, and the Norwegian forces, although probably very both highly paid and heavily equipped, can't really sustain much if Russia were ever to act in any threatening way towards Norway. So the Norwegian defense policy since 1949 has been to rely on the US first and foremost, but NATO as a defense alliance and Article 5. This graph that I hope you can see just highlights it's actually from my hometown and the airbase there, which is the only airbase in North Norway, and the scrambles of F-16 fighter planes that are to identify Russian bombers and Russian fighter planes that are increasingly flying along the North Norwegian coast, not infringing on Norwegian airspace, but still they've been increasing. And if I had included the numbers here for 2016 and 2017, they would have been even a bit higher than this. So there's been quite a lot of activity from the Russian side, increasing, as I said, since more or less 2005, 2006. So for Norway, naturally, it makes sense then to emphasize NATO and emphasize NATO in defending its Arctic and wanting an Arctic policy for NATO. For Canada, however, as some Canadian defense officials, even former foreign ministers have told me when I interviewed them for some of this work, told me that they first of all didn't see a role for NATO. There was no use, right? Because you have some of these famous quotes from Canadian generals saying, if somebody were to invade the Canadian North, the first task would be to rescue them, and these humoristic statements. But more seriously, this idea that number one, there was no need for NATO in the Canadian Arctic, but number two, there was also a slight not fear, but at least concern about tangling in Turkey, Greece, other NATO members who doesn't really have any clear interest in the Arctic. So why would they have a say in the Arctic? Why would they participate in the Arctic? Although it's unclear how exactly that would materialize, but still, it was a spoken concern. Canada could take care of its own defense, whereas Norway, again, completely opposite relationship with NATO. And again, Russia is the key determining variable. And for Norway, this has not changed. Although in my study, I found that it differs, or it started to change a bit when Norway changed governments. So you had Crimea, of course, and Ukraine in 2014, making relationships more difficult. The focus then in NATO in general became very quickly on the Russian border. The North Atlantic was suddenly back on the agenda. Suddenly the US was talking about even reappearing in Iceland, although we'll see. The Baltics, again, also are back on the agenda. So suddenly the Arctic got lost in a way, or at least was reframed. It wasn't so much about the Arctic anymore as it was about Northern Europe and the North Atlantic. And Norway seems very happy with this because it serves the purpose of the Norwegian security interests. And Canada as well seems quite engaged and are even now contributing more than before in Norwegian NATO exercises in Norway, as well as in the Baltics. So, and also you had change of governments. Conservatives came in Norway and the liberals came in Canada more or less at the same time. So suddenly you have new actors and also a new security situation. And the talk about NATO Arctic policy is now a bit dead. So the point is not necessarily, the argument is not that NATO needs an Arctic policy. The point is that looking from a security perspective, the Arctic itself as a region, actually, arguably, I would say, because it is a quite large region, because you have actors like Canada and Norway who are very different in their security outlook and interest, it's not one unison coherent security region if you do the level of analysis on a regional level, right? But then you have other actors, again, as Heather mentioned, Arctic Council, which adds to this, but not talking about security, talking about everything else but security. But still, in Arctic Council, you have very different dynamics taking place, more comprehensive approach or coherent approaches to the Arctic. And then finally, just to highlight also that although Norway sees in many ways, I guess, Russia as the main security adversary and has since the end of the Second World War, there's also a lot of emphasis on cooperation. And this photo was from the signing of the Barents Sea Agreement, the delineation agreement in the sea in 2010, just highlighting that there is this bilateral dual track relationship with Russia from the Norwegians that mixes into this, especially if you go on the lower level, again, talking about the levels of analysis. If you go on the lower level of analysis, looking at the regional level, or trade, energy, cooperation, then a very different picture emerges than when you talk about defense, NATO, keeping the US interested in Norwegian Arctic security concerns. So, to return to the level of analysis issue, I think the example I just used highlights this to some extent. And I think if you using the lenses of your own country, if you look at the way Norway conceives the Arctic on a systemic level, Norway as systemic relations with Russia has deteriorated, as the US and Russia, or the EU and Russia for that matter, are in a more of a competitive environment. The Arctic becomes a natural place where Norway has concerns, security concerns, hard security concerns, investing in military equipment, and Russia does the same. So it's wrong to say that there's no security conflicts in the Arctic, or at least potential for conflicts in the Arctic. And that also fuels a lot of this media analysis that, of course, are a bit short-sighted, but still they do reflect some truth, at least, not all the time, but sometimes. But then if you look at the other levels, look at the regional level, it varies a bit on with what issue you're talking about, and the domestic level as well. So that was more or less my 30 minutes. So let's discuss and argue a bit.
Well, thank you very much, Andreas. And I think it's for one, you're the first one to focus entirely on the security, or predominantly on the security aspect, but also to make that point that people being in a bloc doesn't mean they all have the same positions. They have different interests. And even though you might say there is the NATO and there is the West, it doesn't mean everybody is in the same boat. And we see that, I mean, you mentioned Turkey, and if people talk about Turkey, we currently have a very, very complicated, to put it mildly, situation between, for example, the United States and Turkey. And but that doesn't pertain to the Arctic so much, so let's leave that out of here. But it is interesting to see that. Do you think, since you live in Norway and since you are Norwegian, do you have just, and that's a very subjective question now, that's less maybe less scientific unless you did surveys and focus groups, but do you have the impression that the population is more alert and more aware of the matter, or is that still mostly an issue that's discussed in security circles?
That's a good question. In general, I would say yes, much more alert now than they used to be. The Norwegian media has focused on it quite a lot. over the last years, the Norwegian intelligence service, actually every year they launches their own report outlining the main concerns they have. Then the military does the same, although the intelligence service is part of the military, but still they have different reports, and they all talk a lot about Russia. That gets a lot of media attention, and then that spawns a lot of debate in Norway. So I do think that the public is more aware, but surprisingly, there's still limited amount of real good journalistic work and really good analysis when it comes to Russia. I think if you live in Oslo and if you've ever been to Norway, you know that of course, this is not like Canada where the distance from Ottawa to somewhere else is quite far. But if the distance from Kirkenes to Oslo is quite big geographically, and I think most people in Oslo don't really go up north very often. So I tend to get a feeling, and I'm living in Oslo right now, and I get the feeling that when you go up north, you go to Bodø, my hometown, Tromsø, where the Arctic Council is, Kirkenes, the border with Russia, the debate is always about Russia. It's on the top of everyone's agenda. It's what everyone is interested in discussing. But here in Oslo, less so. Here, I think people tend to perceive Norway as more of a global player, more interested in everything from Brazil to Colombia to developments in China. But of course, as you said, it has increased, but not to the extent that I had hoped almost. Just because I think not necessarily. I don't think Russia is a military concern at the moment, but I think it's something that we as Norway should be more focused on. And more, if you go to University of Oslo, you should be able to study this, and right now you barely can.
You said you barely can, and is that also a reason why you study abroad and why you're so much also active in other scientific institutions outside of Norway?
That's a good question. Why do people travel? To an extent, I think Canada, at least for me, seemed like a very natural place if you want to go and get some perspective and comparison. I would say, though, amongst the research community in Oslo, Fridtjof Nansen Institute, where I am working, but also NUPI, Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, with Alana Wilson-Rowe, whom some of you probably know. The defense institutes we have, University of Tromsø with Gunhild Haagensen-Gjørv and Rasmus Bertelsen, and those people, they're very, very active, very engaged, and do a lot of Arctic work. So I see the academics in Norway as extremely Arctic-minded, if you want. But I see the general public less interested. The Arctic is even here in Norway, by the NRK, the main public broadcaster, our BBC, if you will. Even there, they tend to describe the Arctic in the same ways as the media articles I just highlighted from The Guardian and The Telegraph, right? So there is this almost disconnect or lack of interest, and I'm not entirely sure why that is.
Great. Well, let's leave it. It's also good. We can't answer everything, of course. So it's good to probe in these directions. Also, a question by our other Andreas on the webinar, Andreas Kramer. And I know that Andreas Østhagen, you can read it, but the participants can't. So Andreas Kramer, do you want to read out your question?
No, I don't want to read it out, but thank you for inviting me to ask it in my own words again. And that is really the distinction between the police forces, which carry guns, but their purpose is really control of population inside their territory and making sure that there is law and order. Then you have the intermediate coast guards, which are really still police type force, but they do extend, they project into the waters beyond. And then there is the true military build-up. All of them carry guns, all of them carry uniforms, they all communicate and they help one another in search and rescue, and they're proud patriots for their country in each of those cases. But they have very distinct functions. And I wanted to get, Andreas, your sense about the relative weight of those three units as the Arctic countries build up their capacities in the north.
Thank you. Thank you, Andreas. I think that's a really important question. I'm glad you actually asked, because I forgot to, or I didn't mention it. And you're perfectly right. It's an important distinction or important nuance. In terms of weight, though, it varies quite a lot, and I think you imply that in your question as well. And it was also implied in my talk about Canada and Norway. And I've done quite a lot of work on the Norwegian Coast Guard, or studying the Coast Guard and studying the various Coast Guards in the Arctic. And even the Coast Guard is a fascinating structure, right? Because in Canada, it's a civilian structure. Has guns in the back of the boat, but aren't really allowed even to use them, although they have some police officers on board, of course, when they go into the Arctic that can. Whereas in Norway, the Coast Guard is entirely naval military service. So just that's a clear distinction, even just in terms of one service. And of course, if you see in Canada, and Whitney Lackenbauer in Canada as well has written quite a lot about this, and the use of the Rangers, for example, in civilian for civilian purposes, for search and rescue, for general just awareness in the Arctic. It seems crucial in the Canadian Arctic. So, and of course you have as soon as Canada was building these new vessels, the Arctic offshore patrol ships, or so there, I guess there's still under construction. There was a lot of talk about now Canada is investing a lot in military capabilities in the Arctic. But then again, most of what these vessels would be doing is, as you say, Andreas, is constabulary functions or presence in the Arctic to protect or to enforce rules and protect sovereign rights. So I think Canada and also to a large extent Greenland, although the Danish Navy performs Coast Guard tasks and the Danish military is present with a serious patrol in Greenland, but this also has a very huge civilian task. Iceland doesn't even have a dedicated defense force. It has a Coast Guard, but a very limited one, and it's the other Nordic countries or NATO that takes charge of their defense. The US, I think, is a bit of a different story. I think if you look at the US force posture in Alaska, it is quite significant at Fairbanks. In general, the air bases they have around the Navy, the Coast Guard as well. Coast Guard is a different, interesting structure in the US. So I think, again, that's a very different story. But the US is a very different type of structure or actor than say Canada or Denmark, Greenland. In Norway, I think the concern in Norway has been that there hasn't been enough investments in the north. That we were around the year 2000. We were to an extent we were focusing more on expeditionary forces, not as much as a lot of other European countries, including I guess Germany, Denmark, other countries have been. But there was concerns that we weren't investing enough in our Coast Guard, which is military, in our Navy. But we have now later on come to do so. But as I said earlier, it's limited. It's limited how much a small country, even if we were to spend 2% of our GDP on defense expenditure, as Trump desperately wants now, or maybe even 4%, we still couldn't provide much. We're a small country, even though we have a lot of oil, we don't have that much money. So I think if you look at real defense investments in the Arctic, it is in Russia, and it is taking place there. It is rebuilding or reinvesting in its Northern Fleet, in its Air Force, in various types of bases. And then again, as I said, I think even amongst Russian Arctic experts or experts who look at Russia, there's different opinions whether, to what extent is this used for civilian purposes, search and rescue bases along the Northern Sea route, for example, or is it for military only capacity? Of course, it seems a bit of both, but I think Russia is really the place also where you see the most of the traditional military forces.
Excellent. Thank you for this differentiation and looking at the different layers of government forces enforcing the law, but also the territorial integrity. I want to also encourage, of course, our participants to ask questions. We still have a few minutes if you want to ask a question. And in the meantime, of course, we will continue the conversation. And Andreas, I want to ask you, because we do talk a lot about I mean, you didn't really say threat, but maybe the risk or the growing military potential from the Russian side in the Arctic. And on the other hand, I mean, you showed the numbers of the scrambles and interceptions, and we see that also for other countries, including Sweden or the Baltic states. And This is, of course, these are facts, these are hard numbers. On the other hand, if we look at the bigger picture, there's no real indication that the Russian government would really seek any form of open confrontation or aggression, that these are kind of, well, like skirmishes where it's about testing boundaries and testing reaction forces and a lot of what you would call maybe posturing, right? So in how far do you think this calls for counter posturing or a kind of show of strength, as you hinted at when you talked about the lack or the limits to military investment in Norway? And in how far can we also just say, oh, we can ignore this because this is not actually real, this is just a kind of a big theater game that's being played out, maybe also for domestic Russian audiences? I don't know about that.
That's it's a good question. The real many layers to it, right? The first is the real intent of some of these actions by Russia. When you fly a Russian bomber along the North Norwegian coast, although you don't enter Norwegian airspace, but if you do that, as you say, more frequently, as I showed numbers of, what does that actually signal? Not probably, at least in that case, not so much about the Arctic itself, but more about Russia's interest in showcasing its ability to act as a security actor or a great power, a regional power in Europe. Or you could argue, is it for domestic purposes? Maybe. Is it to train its pilots? Maybe. Or is it to showcase to the UK and others that they're able to fly as far as that? I think in the Arctic, again, it becomes very much about which country you talk about and which security concerns. Speaking from a Norwegian perspective, it's clear to me that, although I'm not working in the defense staff, but it's clear to me that it seems that the main concern for Norway in many ways is number one, the border, the land border with Russia. I know you say, you know, what might be the actual threats. I don't think Russia is going to come across the border anytime soon, and I don't think Norwegians think that either. And as I said, there's many layers to this, right? And I'm always a bit afraid of the rhetoric to use, because I think the way we speak about things also do define things. I think people who work in the defense and security dimensions often tend to talk about Russia as a threat in North Norway, but then they ignore the people-to-people cooperation and the fact that half my colleagues, when I have a part-time position in North Norway, and when I go there and they're all Russians, and we all, there's no issue, right? So this othering of Russia, I'm careful of, but still, Russia did last winter organize a snap exercise along the Norwegian border, which wasn't announced, which you're supposed to do according to international conventions. So, and the Norwegian response was having another snap exercise. So you get this escalating, although it doesn't lead to anything, at least it didn't in that case. You get these actions that provoke and that cause resentment. The Norwegian military headquarters, the chief of the Norwegian military headquarters, has a bi-weekly phone call or conversation with the Northern Fleet and talks with his Russian counterparts. The Norwegian Coast Guard cooperates even today, given the situation. Even today, they cooperate in exercises, not hard military, but other types of exercises. So that speaks to what Andreas mentioned about the search and rescue and the link between military and civilian. So you have those levels to it, but at the same time you have, as I said, the snap exercise. And then moreover, so that's one concern. And the other concern I would like to mention that I know from a Norwegian perspective that is quite important, and I think a lot of people underestimate this, it's Svalbard, and it's the Norwegian concern over Svalbard. Because there, Russia, I mean, they're not going to invade Svalbard either, but there that you could argue, if you put your very skeptical glasses on, you can argue that they are trying to provoke or trying to test Norwegian responses. When you land the deputy minister, Rogosen, unannounced, you land him in Svalbard or in Longyearbyen, when you're supposed to announce every every international actor who comes to Svalbard, or when you do flyovers with military planes and similar like that in relation to Svalbard. So you have these minor incidents, also statements by some officials, even Lavrov, that although they don't confront Norway over Svalbard, they do hint at least if you have Norwegian neurotic eyes and you think that everyone challenged you on Svalbard, then you might be a bit worried. And I think Svalbard, we could have a whole Arctic College session on that on its own. But I think that's a big security concern for Norway, and maybe for NATO to some extent. And again, whether or not that's really true or really it's real, it depends, I guess, on the glasses you put on.
Well, yes, absolutely. And of course, we have to also think about beyond what is immediately visible and beyond what seems immediately possible. I mean, as a German, I'm always reminded of this because, you know, geopolitics doesn't always happen in a linear way. So it's not always a clear trajectory. I just received one comment from one of our participants, Diane Yoder, who said, "Thank you very much, Andreas, for the presentation." She had to go actually because of a wildfire and had to check in with authorities. So Diane, we'll see you next week then again. But she wanted to let you know that she thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. We do have another question though from Andreas Kramer, who wanted to follow up on the search and rescue aspect. And please, Andreas, ask your question.
Yes, thank you. But I will preface that by an observation, and that is that in the Arctic, very often there is a very clear separation between the people who wear uniform and the people who don't. And it's very rare that you get in the same room, in the same discussion, focus on the same topic. You get people from the military domains and from the various civilian domains, economic domains, and so on. And I think that the fact that there are no questions from the participants is in a way a symptom of that separation of domains. And part of what the Arctic Summer College is to do is just to cut across those things. In practical terms, I think in the Arctic Council, the search and rescue protocol was one of those areas, because it's pretty clear that if you are in need of assistance in the Arctic, you want anybody who is near you to help you, whether that is a ship from another country or from your own country, whether it is a military ship, whether it's a civilian ship, whether it's a submarine, whether it's a helicopter, it doesn't really matter. You just want somebody to fish you out of the water or give whatever assistance you need. That is why the search and rescue protocol really cut across all the domains, because it really focuses on a specific challenge that everybody shares and where everybody depends on one another. So I wanted Andreas to a little bit talk about the effect of the negotiation of the search and rescue protocol on that relationship between military and civilian forces. Andreas.
Thank you very much. First, I just want to comment on what you said about different domains as well, and I very much agree with you. I come from, I used to work at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, a very great workplace, with a lot of military people with military backgrounds, and they have a very different approach to it than, say, where I'm working at the moment, where you have more of a scholarly or a public policy approach to it. And I think also it's unfortunate because you don't get the same people talking the same language. But to answer your give some reflections about that, to do some conspicuous self-promotion, I've written a few articles on it, and one just came out. And what I was interested in examining was on many levels how the cooperation, or why the cooperation on search and rescue. Not only search and rescue. I would say search and rescue is one domain that you point out very well, but the institutions or the actors who are performing search and rescue are also the same who perform oil spill preparedness, and the same who do fishery, often fishery inspections and those type of tasks. So the Coast Guard, more or less, predominantly. And I was interested in understanding why they manage to cooperate so well, as you mentioned, and they do cooperate well on many levels. despite Ukraine, despite even restrictions on military cooperation, these military units, because the Russian Coast Guard, the Norwegian Coast Guard, the US Coast Guard are all military units, they managed to cooperate. And it has to do with as you allude to, the fact that these are civilian tasks. And when you mix in civilian things or civilian tasks, civilian challenges, then it doesn't become bogged down in high politics in the protocols. And when it does, even when it does, it seems that the states are willing to push past it. And I think Heather also alluded to some of this, right? The reason why the Arctic Council keeps going and keeps managing to do well is because they avoid hard security. And the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, she also mentioned, which was established in 2015. And it's the same. The Arctic Coast Guard Forum would never have been established if it was an emphasis on security, traditional security. But you get the generals, or not the generals, the admirals around the table to talk, precisely because it is civilian and it is in need. And I think in the Arctic as well, as you said as well, if you're swimming in the ocean, Arctic Ocean that is, if you even swim at all, then if someone picks you up, no matter who they are, it's great. And I think you see that Norwegian in particular, Norwegian search and rescue helicopters from North Norway often help out Russian fishermen and sailors, and it's vice versa. And I think it's very much appreciated. And I think there's no real talk about disbanding this type of cooperation. So again, it's different levels of analysis, if I can refer to some blah blah IR gibberish. But still, I think we have to separate between the various types of level in the Arctic.
Well, thank you. And I think Andreas Kramer also said thank you. Andreas, because we're coming towards the end of the session, and I wanted to ask you, of course, nobody knows the future, right? So it's clearly not that I ask you to tell us exactly what will be the future, but how do you see this evolve if you might project maybe 15 years, 20 years into the future? What scenarios do you have well, do you see as realistic, or from your current position of knowledge as likely?
The most difficult and most dangerous question you can ever ask, political scientist, I guess. But I don't see, just to get that out of the way, I don't see outright conflict in the Arctic. I don't really see that as a probable event or going to happen anytime soon, no matter what, whether it's China or Russia or the US under Trump or someone else. There's no such reason for it, right? There's no resources contested. There's no, even the continental shelf claims that are still being submitted or still being reviewed, they will not lead to anything more than diplomatic negotiations, I predict at least. I think the most conflictual issue in the Arctic right now is fisheries. Whether it's the Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, whether it's snow crabs on the seabed around Svalbard, or how much Russia and Norway should divide their fish stocks, or how much overfishing is in the Bering Sea. I think fisheries is actually the big topic that no one really talks about properly in the Arctic, unfortunately. And that's also where the money is at the moment. But I see it as developing further on. You should have asked this question to Heather, because I'm unable to actually predict the Arctic Council, because I'm not an expert on the Arctic Council, but I'm very curious to see how it will develop and how maybe it will formalize. I hope it formalizes even further. Might be benefits and negative aspects to that as well, but I think more so, I think we're going to see just a more active Arctic. I think China disregarding, how much it can influence through the Arctic Council or not, I think China will get much more involved in Arctic affairs for a number of reasons. And whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, I guess depends on where you stand. But I think all the Arctic states in Norway and the Nordics in particular have to get on board with that and try to utilize that to their advantage. I don't see much happening in the Canadian Arctic, and I think Heather made an excellent point when she says that the rhetoric is still very much the same. Trudeau and his government is yet to launch their Arctic policy. It's still in waiting and has been for a while, and I'm not sure what, you can't reinvent the wheel, right? I think the Canadian Arctic is a very different Arctic than the Nordic and Russian Arctic, and therefore also there will be less things taking place, unfortunately, I think, for also some of the indigenous and local people in the Canadian Arctic. But in general, for security conflict, I don't see any real event taking place, apart from maybe, as I said, Svalbard. You might have some, that might at least be on the agenda sometimes, but I hope and think that given Norway's focus on it and given Russian interest in keeping things relatively calm and peaceful, I don't think that's going to cause serious conflict either.
Excellent. Well, that's a very or quite positive outlook, and it's always good to hear positive scenarios, especially from somebody who knows quite a bit, who knows a lot about these aspects. And Andreas, I want to thank you a lot. Now I can just say Andreas because our other Andreas has left the webinar just a second ago, and he had to run into a different meeting. And Andreas, I hope, of course, it's hard to say, you mostly gave us information. We only ask a few silly questions back, but I really hope you enjoyed it a little bit. I hope we can stay in touch. I don't know if I'll see you at the Arctic Circle Assembly. I hope maybe then another time. And Heather, we will see her there. And I want to say thank you from all our participants, of course. They are muted by default, so you can't hear the applause now, but they thank you. And of course, I hope that your research is continuing on the trajectory, and I hope that we'll talk again about these matters in just as a relaxed way as this year, next year, because it's always good when you can talk about international relations and military relations in a very relaxed and comfortable way, and when it's actually not a very threatening situation. Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you to everybody for signing in and following the webinar. And as always, we'll talk again next week with another module or another session in our governance module with one speaker, Monica Tenberg, and then our group presentation by the participants. So see you next Wednesday again. Have a great rest of your day or evening, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.